Welcome to Human Monsters. Life ain't easy when your stepfather is an abusive piece of shit. Little Eunice shushed her younger sister, Rosalie, even going as far as to put her hand over her mouth. Rosie was crying because her mother and stepfather were fighting in the kitchen. Rosalie was 3 years old and Eunice was 6. Their older brother, Norman, tiptoed across the floor and swept the curtain across the doorway, from which he watched his mother and stepfather fight. Their stepfather, Poland-born Boleslaw Donko, initially came to the property as a hired hand, given that it was a farm. The children's mother owned the farm and had a baby with Boleslaw. Speaking of whom, the baby was what the couple were arguing about. Though the children couldn't understand what they were arguing about because most of what was said was in Polish, they got the gist that he was accusing her of something. After sticking his head out of the window of the children's bedroom momentarily, Norman returned to bed. He suddenly smelled and felt urine. The perpetrators were his twin brothers, Dennis and David. Dennis was remembered for being aggressive and an independent thinker, while David tended to sit on adults' laps instead as a softly spoken soul. Dennis annoyed their mother, who was not affectionate. Like many twins, Dennis and David developed their own language, which was only understood by Eunice. Domko was oddly preoccupied with their language. When he was in a good mood, he would chase them out of the house. At his worst, he would beat them. That afternoon, Norman worked with Domko, removing rocks from the farm's pasture and stacking them. Norman's older brothers, 11-year-old Walter and 10-year-old Stephen, were beaten by Domko the day before because he was dissatisfied with their cow milking technique. They ran away. Peace drew over the household after the children's mother calmed Domko. That is, until baby Kathy began to cry. Sobbing escalated to wailing, and Domko became enraged. I guess he didn't get the memo about the fact that babies cry. He complained that she made too much noise. Their mother picked Kathy up and fished a wash basin so she could give her a bath. She pointed out to Domko that Kathy had cramps because she was given skim milk instead of whole milk. Domko started screaming, saying that the children cost too much money to support. Their mother was quick to point out that the farm belonged to her and that he was the interloper. Little Kathy thrashed around in the basin's water. The other children expected the worst. The twins sat up in bed and wrapped their arms around each other. Eunice drew her arm around Rosalie's chest. Norman escaped out the window. Domko shouted with his thick accent, "I's be showink them, some beach bastards." Their mother tried reasoning with him, but he was out of his mind. He said something about Kathy not being his. He grabbed Kathy from the wash basin, and their mother screamed. The children could hear the thud of Kathy slamming against the wall after Domko threw her against it. Their mother said, "Boleslaw, what have you done now? Get out of my house." The children heard the sound of Domko's boots as he stomped toward their room. They dreaded his arrival. Mercifully, he left the house. They could hear the sound of their mother whispering to Kathy and praying to God in hopes that Kathy would emerge unscathed. The other children began to cry as they knew it was then safe to do so. Earlier that day, Domko accused their mother, Caroline, of having an affair. He had nothing but contempt for her children, characterizing her two eldest sons as lazy bastards. He said, "Who's be helping me with some fence? Dennis? David? Those some beach bastards be some good for nothing." Kathy was only 4 months old at the time, and being thrown against the wall clearly inflicted some damage, possibly of the irreversible variety. She barely moved that night. Her breathing was shallow. She was limp to Caroline's touch. Domko's behavior as of late had been odd. He experienced headaches, which coincided with his violent outbursts. He stopped bathing and shaving. He prowled through the neighborhood at night. He never explained where he went or why. He blamed her for his aberrant behavior, saying she was a terrible wife who endeavored to make his life miserable. She went in to check on the other children. Dennis woke when she came into the room. She said, "Everything is going to be all right. Justice is right around the corner." He turned and went back to sleep. Domko hated Norman. Norman feared him, but his charm and iron spirit could not be shaken out of place by Domko or anybody else. Dennis watched in horror as Rosie was beaten by Domko for the first time when she was 2 years old. Domko shouted at her, "Chocolate bar? Chocolate bar? I's be showing you chocolate bar." He strapped her so hard the blows sent her flying to the floor. David later recalled how it looked like Domko was beating a rag doll. Domko kept beating her until she bled, with droplets of blood raining down from her body to the floor. Wanting to spare his little sister any further torture, Dennis stepped forward and said, "I did it. I did it. I took the chocolate bar." Domko was pleased to hear this. He dropped Rosie to the floor. Domko lunged toward Dennis, who closed his eyes as he braced himself for the beating he was about to receive. After strapping Dennis several times, Domko threw him against the wall. Dennis and David got into the habit of referring to Domko as Satan. Domko was always telling Caroline that she and the children were lucky to have him around. As autumn descended, Domko's moods would worsen. He had a steel plate in his head, and it caused him pain and mood swings. He would lash out at anybody who was unfortunate enough to get in his way. It didn't help that they were an indigent family that struggled not only with household and farm-related expenses, but also with property taxes. One evening in October, David and Dennis were in the living room playing with a toy truck and speaking in their language. When Domko heard them speaking, he assumed they were speaking the language to rub it in the fact that he couldn't understand them. He grabbed them and threw them on the couch. He began punching both boys, punching one at a time, taking turns with each. David cried out as he put his arms over his head, "Mama!" Caroline rushed into the room. She shouted, "Boslaw, leave them alone." Sadly, this had been a regular occurrence recently, with all the children being beaten as viciously. Dennis was beaten twice that week. Caroline tried to pull Domko away from the twins, saying, "You're going to kill them." Domko swung around and punched Caroline in the face. He hit her so hard she fell to the floor. He descended upon her, pummeling her with punches on her head and chest. Eventually, he knocked her out. When she came to, her head was throbbing. There was sticky blood on her hands. She touched her nose, and it activated sharp pains to her forehead. She heard the sound of Domko snickering to himself as he sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and smoking a cigarette. Caroline had been married before, but her husband died of tuberculosis. Her father never approved of him, feeling he was unsuccessful, and he also hated that he was German. He played matchmaker, introducing her to Domko. Things went well in the beginning. He was handsome, had a suitcase full of cash, and they had a passionate love affair. It wasn't long before everything went south. He hated her children and began to lash out at them in violence. This was also something her father approved of, since her first husband had been lenient with the children, and they would occasionally disobey as a result. Eventually, Domko dominated her life as her father once had. Domko hated her children partially because they were half German. He resented the Germans because, as a Polish veteran of World War II, he was forced to work in labor camps after Germany and Russia invaded Poland. Relatives told her he was in and out of jail in his teens and was lashed as punishment. At some point, he was beaten by a gang and left for dead on the side of a road. A good Samaritan took him to a hospital where he was treated for the portion of his skull that had been caved in. He left behind a wife and children in Poland. Caroline and the children sought refuge at a neighbor's home. The family who had lived there were friends. They fed Caroline and the children. They knew what a psychopath Domko was, and they sorted through whatever options Caroline had. She had nowhere to move with all the kids and was too proud to leave the farm and go on welfare. At one point, Domko showed up at the house with a gun. He began circling the house. Gus, the man of the house, got his rifle out and instructed everybody else to go to the cellar. Emma, the matriarch, sat at the table in the kitchen, knitting like nothing extraordinary was happening. The couple's dog had been barking. Gus said, "Sandy, come here, girl. Who's there?" Sandy was greatly agitated, displaying her teeth. Gus shouted, "Who's there?" Someone appeared from around the corner. He said, "Domko, where's be Karloka?" Gus looked down at Domko's rifle. He said, "Caroline isn't here, so you can stop walking around my house." Domko advanced toward the stoop. He smirked and nodded in the direction of Gus's rifle. He said, "Yous be shooting me?" Gus raised his gun an inch or two. "I didn't know who I'd find out here. The dog doesn't usually bark like that." Domko moved closer to the door while looking over Gus's shoulder. He stopped when Sandy became even more aggressive. Gus said, "I said, Caroline isn't here. Did you check anywhere else?" Domko's eyes narrowed. He shrugged and said, "They say it be good here at Harvard's." "By Jiminy, they don't come here because they like my farm. They come here for something to eat. If you'd feed them more often, the kids might like you better. Yet, that's all they's be do. They are children, and you shouldn't treat them like workhorses. Now go home before I charge you with trespassing. Trespass? What? Me? I's be showing you some trespass. Gus backed up to the door and went back into the house. Gus and Emma waited for a while before telling Caroline the coast was clear. Domko posed that kind of threat. Gus and Emma agreed to let the children spend the night at their home. Caroline chose to go home. She told herself that Domko would have calmed down by then. She vowed to herself to be a better wife and mother. Caroline returned to the Harvards' home in the middle of the night and took the children back home with her. Eunice and the rest of the children who happened to be home at the time were informed by Caroline that she was going to find them a new place to live. She told them to tell Domko that she was going out for groceries. She took Kathy and Rosie with her. As Caroline visited her friends, the Draytons, who offered to drive her into town to apply for welfare, Domko walked into the children's bedroom where the twins were hiding underneath a blanket. Domko pulled the blanket aside and pulled the twins up by their hair. He threw them to the floor and kicked each one of them as they tried to escape. They ran to the dining room, wetting their pants from fear. Domko went out to the porch and returned with a lengthy piece of twine. He ordered the boys to remove their pants. Once they followed this directive, he shoved them to the floor by a table. He shouted, "Yous be peacink and shitink and do nothink all day." The boys sat against the wall, their arms around each other. Domko wrapped the twine around them. He tied a knot in it. He said to David, "She's be beachin' around." To their relief, Domko left the house. Dennis said, "Is Satan gone?" David confirmed this. The twins tried to break free from the twine, but it was wound too tightly. As Caroline was driven by her friend Jim Drayton to town, she told him about Domko's abusive behavior. She told him that he hit Stephen over the head with his rifle, knocking him out cold. He dumped his unconscious body in a bush and told Caroline when he got home that he hoped wolves would eat him. He wouldn't allow Caroline to leave the house to attend to Stephen, and he wouldn't allow the other children to do it either, keeping them occupied with chores. Walter was woozy for days. David and Dennis were left bound for hours. When Domko returned home, the older kids had not returned home from school. He cut the twins loose, but he was not finished torturing them. He removed his belt and began whipping them. By then, at least one of the twins had defecated himself. Domko said, "Shitink again. Stinking some beach bastards. Sheeting in but a some pant." Domko whipped the twins until they dissociated from the pain. Caroline returned after 2 days and was surprised to find Domko in a pleasant mood. He was relieved that he hadn't lost her and the children permanently, since that would have meant he would have had to do all the chores by himself. She told him she went to get groceries, but could not due to her inability to get credit, so she applied for welfare. Later, she told Domko that the municipal government would find foster parents to take in Rosie and the twins. She assumed Domko would find this idea to his satisfaction, as he regarded the younger children as little more than pests. When he asked her where she slept, she said it was at friends of the church. The other children rushed to a bed where they sought to find refuge. The twins were hiding underneath it. A social worker came by in November. He said a couple in Winnipeg who were infertile expressed interest in fostering the twins. Finding a home for Rosie presented a greater challenge, he said. The day David and Dennis went to live with the foster couple, David was more enthused about the idea than Dennis. Dennis began to cry because Caroline was not going with them. To sell him on the idea, David whispered to Dennis in their language, "Satan's not coming. He won't get us there. And Norman says the nice people will give us toys and candy." Baby Kathy was lucid, but her body was not developing to the standard common for her age. She was also blind, thanks to Domko throwing her against the wall. Domko had come to accept that Kathy was his biological child, and he regretted what he'd done to her. He promised he would never hit her again. He kept that promise. Eventually, he established a close relationship with Kathy. His feelings about the other children did not change. He tolerated the older kids, but still despised the younger ones. Caroline began to devise a plan to move away from the farm in spring. One day, Domko whipped Rosie until she was covered in gashes and bruises. She bled so much, the blanket that covered her stuck to her skin. After having breakfast, he returned to Rosie's room to beat her again. He said, possibly referring to her convalescence, "Lazy some-beach bastard." He whipped her damaged epidermis over and over. Caroline took all the children with her, including the twins, who were no longer with the couple in Winnipeg, and brought them into town. Well, she wasn't able to take Kathy because Domko wouldn't allow it. She told him she was just taking her to the doctor, but he was always suspicious, so she had to leave Kathy behind. Domko shouted to Caroline as she and the kids made their way down the road in their horse and sleigh. "I's be drowning her." Caroline and the kids stopped off at the Draytons' farm. Jim offered to drive them into town with his car, and so they went. Jim met with municipal officials who told him they could help set Caroline and the children up with a house and a stipend. In the meantime, a landlord agreed to let them stay in his rental for a few weeks. Jim brought Caroline to the RCMP detachment. They were both concerned about Kathy's safety being with Domko all night. The officers did not appear to be concerned. Though they were aware of Domko and his many shortcomings, nothing they were told raised alarm bells in their minds, not even his threat to drown Kathy. They gave Caroline the 3rd degree. "Why did you leave her there?" "He wouldn't let me take her." "Wouldn't let you. You managed to get all the other children out of the house. Why not her?" "He blocked the door." "Why didn't you take her out first? If he's that bad, why did you take a chance?" "It was cold, and I didn't want her to start crying and wake him up." But you left her alone with him. Weren't you afraid he'd hurt her? No, he won't hurt her because she's his daughter. It's my kids he hates. Then what's the big hurry to go get her then? Well, he said he'd drown her if I left. But I thought you said he wouldn't hurt her. Jim was annoyed by the interrogation. He interjected, Listen, that Domko is off his rocker and about as predictable as a bull elk in rut. I've seen it for myself. He's nuts, I tell you. And it's about time somebody did something about it. Now, if one of you don't take her back to the farm to get that baby, then I'll do it. But I'll take a loaded gun with me. One of the officers said, Now, Jim, it's not that we don't want to go. We just want a full understanding of what we're walking into, that's all. We don't want to go barreling in there and run the risk of somebody getting hurt. You're right, the baby should be with its mother, and we can make him give her up on those grounds. Then why are we standing around gabbing? It's getting late, and I have chores to do. The younger officer dressed for the weather. He said, I'll go. This shouldn't take long. Caroline and the officer got into his cruiser and headed for her house. Along the way, he said, Tell me about Mr. Domko. She said, He's like the devil. This is all his fault. He starves the kids and works them in the fields and has spells that make him act crazy. He never bathes or cleans up after himself. I've had enough. When the officer and Caroline entered the kitchen of her house, she was stunned that Domko had done a complete about-face. He was wearing clean clothes. He had bathed. He was clean-shaven. He had Kathy on his lap and was feeding her some homemade stew. Caroline said, I came to get Kathy. Me and the kids are going to live in town. With a sad and dejected look on his face, he stood and handed Kathy to her. This didn't placate Kathy at all, for she reached back for Domko. Caroline said, It's time to go. She bounced Kathy up and down to calm her. Domko said, Go, I's not be venting lazy woman and Keats no more. I's be trying to make farm good, and what you's be doing. Leaving me with Kathy and going to town with all de money and cream. The house was dirty, and Domko started an argument with Caroline over who was to blame. The RCMP officer ended this argument by saying, Well, Mrs. Pischke, we have the child. It's time to leave. She said, I shouldn't have to go. This is my house. He is the one who should have to leave. He shouldn't even be in Canada. Asked to see his passport and papers. More bickering ensued until the officer led Caroline out of the house by her arm. For the first time since Domko moved in, Caroline felt free. She and the kids moved into a larger house in town. One day, Walter burst through the door into the house and announced to Caroline, Mama, Domko's coming. Caroline looked out the window, and sure enough, he was walking toward the house. He was carrying a brown bag in each hand. He greeted the children outside cheerfully, but they did not return his mirth, backing up as he came closer. Caroline put on her shoes and stepped outside before he could enter. He said, Carlorka, it be good to seeing you. She crossed her arms defensively. She said, How are you? Good. I's be bringing for you Aunt the Keats. She didn't accept his gift. He said, What? You's be getting too much food? She took one bag. It contained a freshly killed and plucked chicken. The other bag held 8 bottles of pop. Suddenly, Caroline's defenses dropped. This was the Domko she remembered from their courtship. She missed that Domko during all that time when he beat her and the kids. He said, "I's be coming inside." Caroline called each child to the door and gave them a bottle of pop each. They were dumbfounded to see this generous and benign disposition on Domko. Domko asked to be let in again. They welcomed him in, and they talked in the kitchen as she prepared dinner. She was pleased by the feeling of normalcy that set in. At one point he said, "I's be better now. My head be but a some good." He apologized for how he treated her and the kids. He asked her if she would consider returning to the farm. He said he needed her there and that he loved her very much. Caroline invited him to stay for dinner. She called the children to the table. He was friendly and genteel to them. After he left Caroline, she was sad to see him go, but she also was relieved that he didn't pressure her to make a quick decision. Walter and Stephen agreed to go back to the farm to do chores. Domko didn't hate them as much as the other kids, and he had changed his ways, so they were safe there. One day, Walter asked Caroline if she would consider returning to the farm with the rest of the kids. He went to work on her, endeavoring tirelessly on wearing down her resistance to the idea. That day, she allowed Domko to share her bed. She closed the door, having instructed the children beforehand not to disturb her and Domko. In the morning, Caroline announced they were all going to return to the farm. Some of the children openly rejected the idea, but their mother had the power, so their objections were dismissed. Not only did Domko promise to be a better husband and father, but he promised to convert to her faith, the Jehovah's Witnesses cult. The children remained wary of him. About a week after they returned to the farm, Dennis and David were in the barn one day when they noticed something on top of a haystack. It looked like a rag doll. When they inspected it closely, they discovered it was Rosie, and she appeared to be lifeless. They rushed into the house to bring it to Caroline's attention, but she was fighting with Domko. She was covered with bruises. Domko was angry because he knew Caroline dated a few men during their separation. He drove into town to confront them, taking his rifle with him. He even stormed into one man's house, apparently with the design of killing him. The twins checked on Rosie. She was still alive. She slept on the hay because she wanted to avoid Domko. Caroline didn't check on her because she didn't want to provoke him. Soon, Caroline took the children with her to the township of Ashern, where they settled in a new home once again. Throughout winter, people in town were gossiping about Caroline regularly. There were rumors that she was promiscuous, and the Jehovah's Witnesses were still frustrated that she went her own way. A representative of the faith began visiting her to have talks about the religion and the Bible. They met regularly. The children didn't like him because he would criticize them when their mother wasn't around. Domko came around again, apologizing and making promises. Caroline suspected that all he cared about was having the children do the chores he was forced to do. She was raised to believe that a man should be head of the household and that the wife should be obedient to him. She didn't mind doing all the housework, but she hated being beaten. She placated him by spending the night with him. She would also give him some money from her mother's allowance when he asked. Otherwise, she was seeing some local men, and this was pleasing to her. One night, a local drunk approached her house on a dare from his drinking buddies. They dared him that he didn't have the guts to ask her out. He did, and Domko happened to be there at the time. He beat the man unconscious. Neighbors witnessed the incident and called the police. Domko was put in jail. The children were giddy when they learned of that latter detail. Caroline became pregnant. She would not reveal the identity of the father to anyone, including the Jehovah's Witnesses. They strongly disapproved of her having a second child out of wedlock. They also strongly urged her to move back in with Domko and marry him. After all, this was a time when divorce was considered more sinful than domestic violence. Welfare cut Caroline off because someone wrote a letter to them anonymously reporting that Domko had spent the night with her at her new place on several occasions. Domko hadn't beaten the children for a while. One night he summoned them all to the kitchen. There were 8 chocolate bars laid out on the table. This insinuated that he had one for each child. They were pleased by this display. He had been working them like slaves on the farm, some days to the point where they were prevented from eating at all. He gave a chocolate bar to Kathy, his favorite. He called Dennis over. When Dennis approached him, Domko grabbed him by the arm. He shouted, "Chocolate bar, I's be giving you some." Domko removed his belt and strapped Dennis. Dennis cried out with every strike. Caroline rushed into the room and tried pulling Domko's arm back. He turned from Dennis and started beating Caroline. He struck her chest, back, and head. When the pain became too much to bear, she fled from the house. The other children had already scattered from the kitchen. Dennis was left on the floor, unable to stir. Domko gathered up the chocolate bars and placed them in a dresser drawer. Afterwards, always the sadist, he chuckled to himself, satisfied with what he had wrought. Domko bought a chocolate cake one day. He ate the lion's share and gave a sliver to Kathy. He placed the rest on a cupboard. While Domko took a nap, Dennis and David decided to reach up and get them some cake. David was the one who went up to get it, only in doing so, he accidentally caused the cupboard to come crashing down. This woke Domko. When he rushed into the kitchen, he shouted, "You some beach bastard, yous be breaking it. Yous be some good for nothing." He beat David with a fire log. Caroline came into the room just in time to see him kicking David. She said, "That's enough. You're going to kill him." Domko pushed her back and kicked her in the abdomen. She flew across the room. He kicked her in the back twice before walking out the door in pursuit of David. Caroline spent that afternoon resting in bed. Domko came in and apologized for the abuse. He begged her to forgive him and sat by the bed for an hour at a time. He put the cupboard back together and stocked it with everything that wasn't broken. Domko was still apologizing when Caroline had the miscarriage that he catalyzed with the beating. She expelled it into the wash basin. She was angry and not so forgiving this time. Rosie saw the dead fetus in the wash basin and was considerably disturbed, gasping at the sight of it. Domko, who always hated Rosie, grabbed a cast iron frying pan from the stove and waved it threateningly in her direction. Caroline screamed, "No, Bosla! She's too little. She'll never remember this." "Mrs. Harwart, you gotta come quick. Domko smashed Rosie, and she's lying on the floor." Eunice was frantic. Emma got dressed for the weather and followed her out the door. When Emma and Eunice arrived in Caroline's kitchen, Rosie was lying next to the stove with a fresh blood stain on the wall beside her. Emma knelt to her. The twins were milling about, declaring Rosie to be dead. Emma checked for a pulse and found that Rosie was still alive. Caroline came into the room. Emma said, "What happened?" "I don't know. I was outside in the barn, and when I came in, found her like this." "Where's Domko?" Caroline said she didn't know. She began to pray. Emma checked Rosie's body for broken bones. She whispered her name, but there was no response of any kind. Emma said, "We have to get her up off this cold floor." Rosie moaned faintly as Emma carried her to the children's bedroom. Caroline and the other children followed. Emma said, "I think we should get Doc Stevenson to come see her. Being unconscious like this is a bad sign." Caroline knew Domko would never approve of the doctor visiting the farm. She said, "Can we wait and see how she does first?" Emma said, "I'll stay with her then." Emma instructed her daughter, Marjorie, to go home and tell her father what had happened. Sitting at the dinner table with Gus and Marjorie, Emma said to Gus, "I'm going to report this to the police. Will you take me to town tomorrow? You have to be careful. Caroline might be in trouble too. If the social workers start coming around, she'll lose those children for sure." "Well, maybe that would be the best thing. Caroline must know this. You should have seen her. She was so scared that she wouldn't even call the doctor. A mother shouldn't have to put up with nonsense like that. Have you ever asked if he can be deported?" I'd heard that after beating up that fellow in Ashern, the police came down pretty hard on him. He's not a Canadian citizen, you know. Emma said, "All I know is that she refused to sign the paper to start the process. They asked her to do it while Domko was sitting right there. That would be just like the police, to expect her to stand up to him while they are there, but then fend for herself as soon as they leave. The less we see Domko, the better." To Marjorie, she said, "And you stay away from him. He has lost his mind, and one of these days he's going to kill somebody." Domko was angry that a neighbor's dogs were barking at night, so he strangled them and hung them from a tree. Church officials continued to nag Caroline about marrying Domko. At one point, one of them said, "You're lucky to have him. Nowhere else would you find someone to take on the responsibility of such a large, unruly family." After the twins returned home after their latest turn at seeking solace at the Harwart's house, Domko told them he would kill Gus if they ever did it again. He went into the room where Caroline slept with the twins. She refused to share a bed with Domko. He ordered the twins to vacate the room and began punching them. They left the room. Domko jumped on top of Caroline and began pummeling her. The twins were worried that he would smother her. The twins fled the house. The rest of the children had already left. The twins decided to go to the Draytons' house because they didn't want to put Gus Harwart in harm's way. It was January, and there was 3 feet of snow on the ground. Along the way, the twins grew exhausted, so they built a fire in the bush. In the morning, Jim Dayton spotted the smoke from their fire at a distance and decided to take his horses and sleigh. When he discovered it was the Pischke twins, he said, "What are you kids doing? Trying to burn down my bush?" No, Jim. We had to make a fire to stay warm." "How come you're not at home?" "Satan kicked us out." "How long have you been here?" "All night. He beat us up, and we got lost. He was coming to your house." "Come on, you kids are coming with me." Throughout the ride, the boys and Jim discussed the situation in greater detail. "He doesn't know his arse from a hole in the ground. A farmer I was talking to said you boys are the bad ones, always giving Domko a hard time." "No, Jim, it's not us. We is not the bad ones. Old Satan just tells everyone we is." Ruby Drayton welcomed the twins to her home. They stood close to the stove at first to warm up. She got them to remove their clothes. They were covered with bruises, some fading, some fresh. Dennis had a partially disabling injury on his leg. David's right arm was sore and resistant to elevation. Jim drove the twins to Ashburn, where he brought them to the RCMP detachment to file a report about what Domko had done to them. After taking in the story, the officer said, "Leave the boys with me. I'll talk to my superiors to see what we can do." The Mounties made no changes to the situation. They didn't take Jim Drayton's word seriously because he was always having disputes with Domko over territorial issues. The officer felt uncomfortable about summoning Caroline to question her. When they asked Domko about the twins' injuries, he said they came from roughhousing with their older brothers. After the officer left, Domko removed his belt and whipped both boys. The children were helpless and defenseless against Domko. The police wouldn't help. Their mother didn't and couldn't protect them. Their neighbors would provide momentary refuge, but they always had to return home. Their situation was devoid of hope. Only a shotgun to Domko's brain would have offered relief at that point. Caroline and Domko eloped on January 26th. Domko urged her to marry him because the neighbors who hated him knew he was not a Canadian citizen, and after all the crimes he committed, it might not be as easy to deport him. Being married to a Canadian citizen might help his plight from a legal standpoint, it seemed. Caroline's father and the Jehovah's Witnesses were happy with the arrangement, which was apparently considered more important than the children's safety and well-being. The Jehovah's Witnesses hoped she would be a better wife, which they assumed would improve her relationship with Domko. Walter spent the winter trapping muskrats, whose hides he planned to sell in Winnipeg. Domko took the hides to Winnipeg and pocketed the money for himself. This was the last straw for Walter. He moved in with a neighbor family who eventually moved to Winnipeg. They helped him get a job there. He never moved back to Caroline's house. One day the children discovered that Caroline was missing from the house. Domko told them she was in hospital, but did not furnish them with an explanation. While the children were working in the barn one day, Domko came in and killed Rosie's cat with the blunt end of a shovel. She cradled the cat as it died. Domko was amused by what he had done, chuckling to himself. Caroline was in the hospital due to complications in her latest pregnancy. The baby was born premature, but otherwise in good health. She was dismayed when she returned home to find that the house was even dirtier than before, with manure and dirt tracked all over the place. The children were filthier than usual and had barely been eating. The place stunk to high heaven. One night, a calf experienced separation anxiety in the absence of its mother and began to bellow loud enough to be heard by everyone in the house. Domko blamed Caroline's children and strapped them with his belt, sparing no parts of their bodies. He was especially brutal to David, who got stuck between the bed and the wall. Domko forced Dennis and David to steer their cattle over to Jim Drayton's oat field. Otherwise, the twins would have received brutal beatings. It wouldn't have taken long for the horses to do some serious damage to the oat field. Before long, Jim Drayton drove up in his tractor. He was enraged. He said, "What the hell is this? Get your goddamn cattle off my field." Domko made us do it. Jim Drayton saw the bruises on the boys, the telltale sign of the consequences that would befall them if they had not driven the cattle to his land. Jim said, "Well, at least help me get them off here. Then I'll go talk to that stupid ass." Jim's confrontation with Domko started with Domko saying, "I's not be doing it, they's be. That's bullshit and you know it. If those boys chased the cattle into my field, it's because you told them to. They's be watching but a some cow. They's be good for sheet. You can't fool me with that innocent act. I can see right through you, so don't waste your breath lying to me." Domko warned Jim that he would kill him if he didn't vacate the property. He said, "I's be killing lots of men. I's be shooting but a some Drayton. You're gonna shoot me? I'm not afraid of you, you stupid son of a bitch. I've got a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it either. I've shot lots of men too. You keep your cattle off my land, or I will shoot you." The children discovered a hiding place in the attic of the house, part of an addition that was built onto it. One night, Domko was surprised to find that only Dennis was present. He began to slap him, and the slapping escalated to punching. Dennis cried and bled to sleep as Domko chuckled. A social services worker named Mrs. Burnett paid a visit to the farm. The twins happened to be outside at the time. She said to them, "The police were called about you children. The neighbors say that Domko hits you. Is that true?" Initially, they were reluctant to answer her truthfully, since reporting the abuse to outsiders typically resulted in the inertia of all authorities, even the RCMP. However, Dennis's intuition told him she could be trusted. She said, "It's okay. I won't tell him what you say. I can only help you if you tell me the truth. Satan smashes us all the time. Who?" Dennis gestured toward the house. She asked the boys to lift their shirts. She shook her head as she surveyed the large bruises and protruding bones of malnutrition and the filth that encrusted their bodies. Dennis had some small bald patches on his head where his hair had been pulled. Margaret Burnett thought to herself, "It's high time that somebody did something about this." She filed a report with the Manitoba Child Welfare Department, recommending that a social worker pay a visit to the farm. Having requested some privacy so he could question Caroline alone, the social worker said, "Does Bob mistreat the children from your first marriage?" Caroline was afraid that her firstborn children would be removed and placed in foster care. She said, "The boys are having a hard time believing their father is gone. I've been too easy on them, and now they don't want to work or listen to Bob. It's not his fault that they run away. They just do, and the neighbors take them in. The neighbors don't like Bob and listen to the lies that the kids tell. They're just kids telling stories, that's all." What about reports that the twins have bruises all over their bodies? They are always fighting with their older brothers, who are too rough. They also appear awfully thin. Why is that? Bill was thin like that. And besides, they don't eat for days when they run away. There's nothing I can do if I can't find them to feed them. What about their school attendance? I've been told that the boys are forced to work instead of going to school. The kids have chores before and after school, just like all the kids around here. They'll never learn to work if we don't make them. They miss school only when they run away. The social worker suspected that Caroline was lying to him. After years of experience as a social worker, liars become more and more transparent to you. He was an expert on the signs of abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, there was little in the way of documented history when it came to the dysfunction of this family. He could talk to neighbors, and the RCMP may have established a paper trail, but it wasn't enough evidence-wise. He could tell that the children were definitely neglected, but whether or not they were in danger was not something he could prove at the time. Also, it was uncommon for children to be removed from the home only after one visit from a social worker. Besides, a social worker's job was to resolve a family's problems, not to traumatize the children by upending their lives. The social worker decided that the best thing to do about Domko's abuse at the time was to scare him. He told him he was putting the family on probation. He said that if the neighbors made more complaints, there would be a deeper investigation. The threat worked for about a month. Domko feared the actions of government officials. He was easy on Caroline's children for about that long. One day, Caroline summoned the twins to the table in the kitchen. She had a proposal for them. She said, "I have an idea that I think will be good for both you boys and Domko. I think that maybe we should change your last name to Domko, and that you boys should start calling him Dad. He might consider you his children and not be so hard on you." Caroline had already betrayed her children in more ways than one. Now she suggested that their very identities should dovetail with his. Did she even love her children? Dennis and David sure weren't thrilled with this idea. They were hoping that she was going to inform them that they would be placed in another foster home. David spoke up as an ambassador for reason and dignity. "No, we can't do that. We don't want to be Domkos." Dennis said, "Yeah, I'd rather be dead than call him Dad." Mrs. Stupid said, "What's wrong with that?" Dennis said, "He ain't our dad. He's nothing like Dad. Nothing at all. I hate him. And wish our real dad was still alive. Well, he's not, so just quit talking about him. Because you miss your real dad, you don't want to give Domko a chance. David said, No, Mama, that's not why. He's mean to us. That's why we don't like him. We can't call him Dad. Fine then, but I don't want to hear you mentioning your father ever again then. Do you hear? One day, Domko forced David to drive their 4 horses to Gus's property and let them eat his hay. Gus showed up. David said to him, I'm so sorry, Gus. Domko made me chase them in here. Well, I'm sure glad we came today to haul this hay home. Otherwise, Domko would have you in here with his animals every day until the snow flies. After beating Norman outside with a stick, the children's dog, Bruno, ran over to protect Norman, biting Domko on his forearm. What did Domko beat Norman for? For, quote, stealing. What did he steal? While collecting their mail, he put a 3-cent apple on their account at the supermarket. Domko ran off and returned with his rifle. He shot the dog twice. The dog suffered considerable pain before Domko took the head shot. He derived great satisfaction in the pain he was inflicting on this dog, and, by proxy, everyone else, chuckling to himself. Afterwards, he would frequently taunt Norman about his murder of the dog, saying, Norman, where's be Bruno? Norman ran away to a neighbor's farm after Domko beat him one time too many. Reinforcing his reputation as no friend to animals, Domko tortured one of the family's horses for being stubborn by hitting her on the head with a shovel. He switched to a pitchfork, stabbing her in the rump before inserting the tines into her reproductive organs. She was barely mobile afterwards. Two social workers paid a visit to Caroline's farm. Once again, Caroline blamed the children for their truancy and for running away, saying they were making Domko's life miserable because he was not their biological father. If the children thought their mother would be a source of optimism, their hopes were dashed one day when David and Dennis approached her in her room. She said, Don't worry, boys. Justice is right around the corner. It looks as if we'll be dying on this farm, likely by Domko's hand. But death isn't something you need to be afraid of. It is something to welcome. I've done all I can here, and I'm ready to go to heaven. But Mama, we don't want you to die. We don't want to die. We want to live in Moosehorn someday. Maybe that will happen, but maybe it's not meant to be. But I don't want to go to heaven yet. Don't worry, son. It's a wonderful place. You children won't have to worry about Domko. It is a place where everybody loves everybody, and only the best people are chosen. You are such sweet boys. You'll be there with me, and it will be wonderful because there are beautiful animals and there's lots of food for everybody. By the end of the night, Dennis wanted to die too. Caroline accepted her life and was not driven to fight it. Domko had won. Join me next week for part 2 of The Wrath of Domko. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.